Hey guys, it's Chloe. Welcome back or welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be installing Fox 2.5 Race Series coilovers on my 2019 Toyota Tacoma, and I'm going to be showing you guys the entire installation process. The particular shocks that I'm going to be installing today are ride height adjustable, so I'm going to be setting them so that it gives the front of my truck enough to lift to level it out with the rear of my truck. Now this video is going to be pretty similar to another video I made where I installed the rear Fox shocks on my Tacoma, so you can check that out if you're looking how to install rear shocks on your truck. And I have a lot of other videos if you're curious on why I picked these exact shocks, want to know more about these shocks, or want to know why I'm leveling out my truck in the first place. I'm going to have links to all my videos where I talk about my suspension in the description down below. So now before we get started, let's go around the truck and take some measurements in the front and in the rear so that we know how much we need to adjust the shocks during our installation. Now we're going to take some measurements on my Tacoma to see how high the front and the rear is, just so we can get a ballpark idea of how much we need to lift the Tacoma to get it level. And these measurements are good to do so that after we finish, we can see the exact difference of how much lift we did. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be measuring from the ground to the bottom of the fender flare on both sides, and I'm making sure my measuring tape crosses right through the middle of the wheel so that I'm getting more or less an accurate reference point. So for the passenger side front, we're almost at 35 inches flat, maybe 35.1 inches, and I believe this is 1 inch larger than factory height because I do have slightly larger tires than the ones that come stock on my TRD off-road. Now the rear passenger side, that looks to be almost exactly 2 inches higher than the front. We're at 37 or maybe 37.1 inches. Driver's side front is a little bit lower than the passenger side front. We're at 34 3/4 of an inch. This is expected because the weight distribution on this side is a little bit greater than on the passenger side. Lastly, rear driver, 36.5 inches. So basically these measurements tell us that we need to lift the front about 2 inches, maybe a little bit more on the driver's side of the truck. And what's good is that I confirmed with my contact at Fox that the shocks out of the box are already adjusted to give it 2 extra inches. So theoretically, we're not going to have to adjust them at all, although we might adjust the driver's side a little bit to accommodate for the lean. The first thing I'm going to do for this installation is installing the sway bar relocation kit, which is basically just 2 spacers that push the sway bar away from the shock. This is the stock Bilstein shock, and this is the sway bar right here. Now, if you're installing a 2.5 with shock, which is exactly what we're doing here, it's obviously going to be wider than the stock shocks, so the spacers are there to prevent the spring from rubbing on the sway bar. Now, for this clearance issue, when you're installing greater width shocks, some people actually don't do this relocation kit at all. They'll actually just remove the sway bar altogether because the new shocks are going to be stiffer than the stock shocks, but I wanted to mention that just in case that was an option for some of you guys. So all you're going to need for this is a 14mm socket, and what you're going to do is remove these 2 bolts, which will drop the sway bar, and you're going to do this on each side. And this bracket's also going to come off. Also, I want to know I'm using a socket extender to remove these 2 14mm bolts, and this is because it'll basically allow me to do this entire sway bar relocation without actually having to remove my skid plate, which is nice. So we're going to do the exact same thing on this side, except for our last bolt, we're going to make sure we hold the sway bar up so that it doesn't come down too quickly and hit something. So we're going to take one of our spacers, and it's going to be oriented exactly like this, and it's going to sit right here. Basically, we're going to use the 2 factory bolts that were originally holding the sway bar bracket in place to get the spacer on the frame. Then after that, we're going to use bolts provided by Fox, which also look to be 14mm, to hold the bracket in place. Also, I'm going to be using some Loctite on all the bolts. So now that we have the spacer in, we're going to put the original bracket that was holding the sway bar up back. Just to give you another visual of what I did here, we have the frame, the spacer with the 2 factory bolts, and then the sway bar that's held in place with the original bracket with the 2 new bolts from Fox. actual install of the new Fox shocks themselves. I actually just finished the driver's side, so I'm going to show you guys the passenger side, which is going to be identical to what I did on the driver's side. The first thing you're going to want to do though is jack up the truck on both sides, because you do need the wheels and tires removed, since we're going to actually be moving the sway bar to give us room to take out the old shock and put the new shock in. So since the sway bar connects to the spindles on both sides, we're going to have to access it, and that's why we need to remove both wheels and tires. So high level, what we'll be doing is there's 3 bolts at the top of the shock and 1 bolt at the bottom of the shock that connects the shock to the lower control arm. So basically we're just gonna have to remove all those bolts. However, the tricky part here is figuring out how we can get clearance to actually move that old shock out and put the new shock in, because as you can see, we have the sway bar in the way, which like I said, we're gonna have to move, and also the tie rod's in the way. So after removing the sway bar link from the spindle, a lot of people will actually go the route where they loosen some of these bolts on the lower control arm and maybe also move this tie rod. But if I remove the spindle from the upper control arm and move the sway bar out of the way, there's actually enough room to take out this shock and put the new shock in. Now do note that if you go this route, you will probably need another person, because someone needs to hold up the upper control arm. Although if you're clever with maneuvering things, you may be able to figure out how to do this all yourself. So we're going to start by removing the sway bar link from the spindle, and to do that we're going to need a 17mm ratchet wrench as well as a 6mm Allen wrench. All we're going to have to do is loosen this nut, so I'm going to use my ratchet wrench for that, and I'm going to use my Allen wrench to basically hold it all in place while I'm doing it. Now once the sway bar link is removed from the spindle on both sides, we're going to be able to move the sway bar up, and it'll give us a little bit more clearance to actually remove the shock down here. Until we detach the upper control arm from the spindle though, you can actually just let it rest down here as this until it's time to take out the shock and put in the new shock. Next, we're going to remove this bolt, which holds a bracket in that holds, I believe, the ABS line. Next, we're going to remove the upper control arm from the spindle, and to do that, we're going to first have to remove this cotter pin. So I'm using a pair of needle nose pliers, and you basically just want to get a good grip and figure out how to kind of maneuver it in order to pull it out. As you can see, mine has quite a bit of surface rust on there, even though it's a 2019 truck. It did spend 1 winter in New York. Next, we're going to remove this nut, which is a 19mm. I will be needing the breaker bar for this. Next, I'm going to be using a mallet to separate the upper control arm from the spindle. On the other side, this was the most difficult part. Honestly, it probably took the longest amount of time just because I wasn't hitting hard enough. So you can also use a hammer for this, but I'm going to try malleting it out first on this side. What helped me a little bit on the other side was using some Lucas Oil Toolbox Buddy. So I'm going to spray a little bit of that, and hopefully this will make it easier.
One eternity later.
So I was finally able to get the upper control arm separated from the spindle, and the key point seemed to be the side over here, which was a little bit more flat, and me switching to the hammer. Also, the reason you want to keep the nut on the bolt is because this thing is preloaded, so the nut can kind of catch this. So once you take the nut out, remember that the upper control arm is preloaded. The two should separate, so you want to make sure you're holding on to your spindle because you don't want to be putting any extra stress on these brake lines. Next, we're going to remove the top of the shock by removing 3 bolts. So there's a bolt right here, a bolt right here, and a bolt behind the bushing. Whatever you do, you absolutely do not want to remove this bolt accidentally, because this is the bolt that holds the spring onto the shock itself. So if you accidentally remove this, you can seriously get hurt because of the spring. These are 14mm sockets I'm using. The last bolt to remove, which will actually allow us to remove the shock, is this bolt right here, which attaches the shock to the lower control arm. So I'm going to be using a 19mm wrench to hold the bolt in place, and a breaker bar. Now I'm going to remove the lower bolt that's holding the shock in place. So we're gonna move the sway bar to give us clearance to remove the shock. And this is the OEM stock Bilstein shocks on the TRD off-roads. Next, we're gonna be installing the brand new coilovers. Now, we wanna make sure that this little spacer here is facing the front of the truck because it is here to clear the sway bar. So basically, as I expected, just because of the greater width of the shock, it is hard to put in alone. So I am going to use an extra pair of hands, and basically that is to rotate the spindle and lift up the upper control arm as I'm putting the shock in, because that just creates more room. So it's going to make this a lot easier. So if you're following along, I want you guys to know that you should make sure that the bolt that holds the spring collar in place needs to be showing, or else you won't be able to adjust the preload while it's on the truck. You want this bolt to be accessible, or at least you want to loosen it before you put the shock on the truck so that you can adjust the preload. Honestly, I'm not sure why my shocks came with the ring positioned such that the bolt was not already facing outward, but later in the video I talk about how I had to take the entire shock out and fix this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these bolts that came with the Fox kit. These aren't the original OEM bolts, but they are the same bolts that were partially used in the sway bar relocation kit. And I'm just gonna, for now, hand tighten them down to put the shock into place so we can fit the bottom of it. So now I can take the shock and push it up and tighten the bolts down even more. I'm gonna make sure to torque these bolts down to spec later at the end when I'm torquing everything down. The next thing we're gonna do is align the bottom of the shock, or where the spacers are, with the tabs in the lower control arm. And we're gonna take the original bolt that we used with the Bilstein shock, once you get that bolt back in place, we're gonna take our washer and our nut and we're gonna tighten it down. So it's pretty tight down now to the point where the shock won't move, but of course we're going to torque it to spec at the end. So next I just took my other Pro Eagle jack and basically lifted the lower control arm so that it's easier to connect the spindle to the upper control arm again. I'm gonna fit these two components together, and then I'm gonna use the OEM nut that we took off from the old assembly and basically reverse what we did. We're also going to take the cotter pin that we originally had taken out from this bolt, and we're going to put it through the middle of the bolt and fit it around. We're also going to reconnect the ABS line, or the bracket that holds the ABS line, back onto the upper control arm. Before I reconnect the sway bar, I'm making sure to torque down my bolts. So we're going to torque down the lower shock bolt, and I set my torque wrench to 80 foot-pounds. Lastly, I'm going to take a paint pen and mark my bolts, and basically this is just a double check peace of mind so that you know which bolts you already torqued down, and for some reason if any nut or bolt comes loose, you can see it. The last thing I'm going to do is on both sides of the truck we're going to reconnect the sway bar. We're going to pull the sway bar up and connect the sway bar link to the spindle. So now it's time to do kind of what I've been waiting for this whole time and see the height after we have installed this lift. Now I haven't driven my truck yet, so everything still has to settle, but I'm curious to see the measurements now. Originally we had 35.1 or around 35 inches, and we expect a 2-inch lift, and right now we're actually getting only 36.5 inches. So interesting, we got about 1.5 inches of height, but definitely a noticeable difference. Now let's go try the driver's side. Previously this was just under 35 inches. I think it was 34.75, and now we're at 36.25. So also raised it 1.5 inches. So that's good. The lift is consistent on both sides, but it's 1.5 inches. Now theoretically the rear should be the same height that they were before. We're sitting at exactly 37 inches, so pretty much the same. And on the passenger rear, we're at 37.25. So very similar to what the previous measurements were. Before I decide if I'm going to adjust the preload, I'm gonna go on a test drive. So after the test drive, the lift settled, and after retaking measurements again, I only gained overall 1 inch in the front on both sides, even though I expected 2 inches, since this is what Fox advertises from these shocks straight out of the box. So I jacked up the truck, and now I'm going to adjust the shocks to get higher lift. So to adjust the preload, which is going to give us greater ground clearance, as you can see, I have the truck jacked up on both sides, and I actually just finished the driver's side, and now instead of the previous 1.625 inches of thread showing, we have about 2 inches of thread showing. So I'm gonna adjust the other side to have the same amount, maybe slightly less, just because the driver's side does need a little bit more height. But I do want to point out one thing here on the passenger side. As you can see, the adjustment bolt here isn't showing at all, and I installed the shock this way. Now this is a problem if you're going to adjust it like I am now, because if you can't get to that bolt to loosen up this ring, then you can't loosen up this ring at all. So what I actually had to do, unfortunately, was take out this shock completely. So disassemble upper control arm from the spindle, move the sway bar out of the way, take out the shock so that I could get to that bolt and loosen it. Now we're going to be able to use a spanner wrench to adjust this collar. Now if we go back to the driver's side, you can see right here, this is the bolt that's exposed, and this is the one that you need to loosen to adjust the collar. So when we're done adjusting the passenger side, I'm going to make sure that this bolt is exposed again, just in case we need to adjust it even more. So moral of the story is if you have these shocks or similar shocks, remember that when you're putting them in, you do want to make sure that you can access this bolt or whatever else is used to loosen up this collar. Alright, so getting onto adjusting this side, as you can see, we do have about 1.6 inches of thread showing, so we're going to increase that to about 2 inches, maybe under 2 inches. Again, although our bolt's not showing, it is loosened, so we should be able to adjust this collar. And you can use a spanner wrench, but I'm actually using an alignment bar because it's going to give a lot more leverage. Since we're compressing the spring, this is just going to be harder to do as you go down, and an alignment bar is just going to be a lot easier than a spanner wrench. I was having trouble with using the spanner wrench before, but I found this tip from a video from, I believe it was Low Range Off-Road. So if you want more details and tips on how to do this, I'm going to link their video down below too. If you're having trouble moving this adjustment collar, what's going to help is using a little bit of Toolbox Buddy to lubricate the threads. So once you get the preload adjusted to what you like, I actually had a little bit of trouble on this side, more than the other side, by trying to use both the spanner wrench and the other tool I was using, but I was still able to get 2 inches of thread showing, which is exactly what I wanted anyways, because I did the same thing on the other side. So now I'm going to tighten down the bolt that was allowing us to adjust it in the first place. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to pull this adjustment ring down anymore, so I'm really hoping that when I put the wheel and tire on and then take it for a test drive to let it settle, I hope the ground clearance is a little bit higher than it was before. So we're going to see. This is kind of an iterative process where we're going to have to keep making adjustments. That's the way it is with these installs. So after adjusting, driving, and then measuring a couple times, I could only adjust the preload so much since the spring was getting stiffer and stiffer, and it didn't make it any easier. The most I was able to get was 1.25 inches, which I'm a little bit disappointed about, but I'll share my thoughts and details and final measurements at the end of the video. So guys, it is the next day, and Cody and I here are about to head over to 4-Wheel Parts to get the truck all aligned. Now I drove the truck about 20 miles and it did settle, and I'm going to give all the measurements at the end, but just first impressions, there's noticeably less body roll for sure, and just the overall ride quality and handling is much better. So we're going to head over to get the alignment done, and when we get back, I'll talk about the final measurements with you guys. So guys, I just got back from my alignment at 4-Wheel Parts. Now, I know 4-Wheel Parts is a big box store, but they've always taken really good care of me, so the alignment was pretty pretty quick. And the adjustments they made during my alignment were pretty minimal because I didn't lift my truck too much. They did correct my toe angle because my truck had a negative toe, which I believe means the tires were pointed a little bit outward, and everything else they measured was in their tolerance, so we're all good to go now. If you're curious to see the measurements they took before and after my alignment, I'll have it up on the screen right now. Now lastly, I want to talk about the difference in height that the new suspension gave me. So in the beginning of this video, before I installed the new suspension, we took measurements. So the driver front side by measuring from the ground to the bottom of the fender flare by bisecting the wheel was previously 34.75 inches and now is 36 inches. The passenger front was 35.1 inches and now is 36.25 inches. And the rear sides on both sides stayed the same. And to give you a reminder, that was 36.5 inches on the driver's side and 37 inches on the passenger side. So pretty much in summary, this means I was able to lift my truck about 1.25 inches, but I still need about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch to give it its true level. Now I was aiming for that true level and I did lots of different adjustments, and I did adjust the collar as much as I could, and this was really the most I could get. It got really tight, and I don't know if I just wasn't strong enough and wasn't pushing the collar down enough because of the spring being compressed, so I'm probably gonna have to talk to Fox about that. But don't get me wrong, I'm still really happy with the way it turned out. It's obviously lifted higher than it was before, and I love the way it looks and the way it rides. So coming up in the future, like I said, I'm gonna be making a video talking about the ride quality specifically for both on-road and off-road with these new shocks. And then I also might try to get that extra 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch in lift, because that was the original goal, but I still want to see how much I like the truck as it is right now. This install was definitely challenging, more so than in the rear, because the rear was pretty much just 2 bolts for the shock itself. In the front, there's much more going on, so there's just more you have to be careful with. But I think the hardest part for me was just adjusting the shocks, putting the wheels and tires back on, driving it a little bit, and then measuring it. So overall, I rate this install medium. It took me a couple hours to do, and I had to work a little bit through the night. So if you have the tools and of course enough interest in installing your suspension yourself on your Tacoma, you definitely can do it. Just be careful. Make sure you read the instructions that come in your suspension kit. And if possible, it's always nice to get someone to help you out. So that's all I have for this video for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to connect more with me, you can follow me on my Instagram. I am at Chloe Kuo Taco. I'm going to post some more pictures of my new suspension on there. And again, I'm going to have all those videos coming up for you guys soon. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.